the Artisteacher Network, which is developed with between UCL, the Institute of Education, UCL, and Freelands Foundation. And over to you, Andy.
Thank you for inviting me today. It's been a while since I've been to Goldsmiths, and that's not because I was banned for any reasons. I just stopped those vicious rumours now before they start. Or I didn't pay my library fines or anything like that. It's more to do with simply, I suppose, losing touch. And so I'm pleased to re-establish that contact. And thank you for thinking that I can contribute to obviously your session today. It's a really valuable, important topic. And if I'm honest, I kind of struggled to think about, well, how does what I want to speak about relate? So I'll talk a little bit about that. So, excuse me. So also in contrast and to complement some of the things that have been said earlier, certainly by, perhaps by Dennis, I am neurodiverse. I'm a dyslexic artist, and so there will be very little text. There will be a lot of visuals and a lot of art and a lot of images. So, and also stories, which is also similar today. So I thought that would be quite interesting. So I was pondering when invited to speak on how what I wanted to talk about related to this theme. And I suppose I'm thinking about colleges in terms of practice, being about pedagogies and processes that relate to the focus of where we work. I'm raising questions and perhaps about an awareness of the environment where we teach and where we make art. And I suppose I'm thinking about ecologies that can be made in cultural relations to the belongings and the developings of a network, a forum. Sometimes I call it a forum, sometimes I call it a network. Forgive me if I've flicked between them. With like-minded artist-teachers. And ultimately, I suppose I'm going to discuss a community of practice, really, around being an artist and a teacher. As I said, you'd be pleased to hear... Oh, now, here we go. How do I do that now? I want to get back onto this screen with my cursor.
So you've got... you need to come off that side, the left-hand side, I'll bring you back on the right.
I really appreciate it, thank you. Yeah, so I'm really pleased, as I said, to be here because there's lots of pictures and stories to tell about those kinds of relationships that have been developing. It's going to be theory light, reference light, and probably less academic than most of the previous presentations, because I'm going to leave you to look at some of the images and sort of listen to the words of the artist teachers as they talk and as they express their sorts of insights about their practice. I've not fully analysed some of these stories, so I'm keen to leave you to make your own observations towards the end and your own conclusions. And what I've tried to do, I suppose, in respect of the artist's words, I've just tried to sort of extrapolate some of my thoughts about some of the relationships that are taking place here and some of the understandings. So my presentation today will cover the following: a little bit about context, a little bit about the historical background of this and my relationship to it. There'll be a little bit about the visual selection of some of the studio spaces. I want to just sort of flag some of the environments that perhaps initiated thinking on how to start the project where we work. And then I think I've got 8 stories. Yet a range of the Artisteacher Network. And I think this is about very much about a journey, a group on a journey that's been developing their knowledge and their understanding of practice. Okay. Yeah, so for those of you who perhaps don't know me, I work at UCL in terms of I teach on the PGC Secondary Art and Design course. I work on the MA in Museums and Galleries and a little bit on the Art and Design in Education. But I describe myself, I suppose, as an artist teacher, as an artist researcher, and teacher, and I suppose they're kind of a couple of strands to my practice in that, you know, I very much exist, one, in the world of art education, visual art practice as research and making, and two, in the sort of kind of transdisciplinarity kind of area of collaboration and certainly dialogic sort of approach when thinking about these sorts of things. I've always been active in my own practice, and this has worked side by side sometimes with the different phases of my teaching. And I was intrigued to hear people talk, I think Terry talked about that sort of wearing of different hats at different points and that relationship to, you know, the sort of different teaching contexts and your own practice. And certainly in the earlier stages of some of my work, I can certainly identify with the, not necessarily compartmentalised, but the sort of, sometimes the need, sometimes the desire. Less so now, less so for all sorts of reasons, perhaps we could talk about later. But a lot of my practice has been based around collaboration as an artist, and that commitment to a dialogue with partners, with communities, with the learners. And that started really very, very early on. I mean, post my degree, my first degree, I went to work in a foundry, oddly. I was a kind of an artist in residence in a casting company, casting foundry in Butley in Derbyshire for 6 months, where I did a residency and a commission. And I think that was seminal in all sorts of ways, because that project, based in a foundry, working alongside the factory workers, the people on the shop floor, the people in the pattern room, the people in the different sorts of processes, they were making engine blocks and pit wheels for coal mines, casting these huge entities, while I was sort of making this rather peculiar, bespoke kind of one-off piece to sort of show the sort of, ultimately, the flexibility of what they were able to do. It was always about what they could do, their processes, less so than what I could perhaps do. But it was quite interesting that, you know, within a very short period of time, I stepped out of the world of the art college, out of the world of the art, and into a very different world where it was important to have conversations. It was important to be able to articulate in this very different space than what I used to be able to inhabit. To be able to speak in ways to be able to achieve things, to get things done, but also just on a daily human basis was really important to talk to mainly working class men who were sort of looking at you most of the time through the side, looking, what is he doing? What is this chap up to? This is rather strange. Why is he here? So all of those kinds of things kind of then developed into me sort of working more in residencies in schools, residencies in sort of other sorts of contexts. I worked for the Forestry Commission for a while in a sculpture park, as well as universities. Very much linking that, talking with the learning, very much thinking about that relationship between my practice and those different contexts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Artisteacher Network, because it grew out of a number of things and it has developed, and I just wanted to sort of place a few of those kind of markers to make sense of the context. So the Artisteacher Network is in collaboration with the Freelands Gallery in Chalk Farm, and they host, basically, they support the network. But actually the network drives, it sort of organises, and it sort of generates. And so that's kind of interesting in terms of how that relationship works with them as the gallery. So why would we set this up? Why would this be something of use? Well, the artist-teacher philosophy has been a sort of core principle for over 20 years on the PGCE course, secondary course at the Institute. And it's been quite fundamental to our training of art teachers, the idea of them retaining their identity, retaining their practice, their specialisms, and thinking about how that informs their development, how that informs their plans, how that informs the way that they operate in the classroom. And so what had happened is that once they had kind of gone out into the school, out into London to work, many of them wanted to retain those conversations, wanted to retain that collective sort of those opportunities for talking about what they're doing. And so we felt that this was a nice opportunity for the alumni, and it came out of our partnership schools, out of our mentors discussing about how we could support them. How could the PGCE course do more than just help them with the paperwork and with the sort of latest government initiative? How could we help them as individuals? How could we sort of think about what was relevant, important to them in their development, as opposed to, you know, as I say, giving them the latest understanding of a policy? And I think at that moment in time, this kind of practice was kind of dropped off the radar in some ways, certainly in schools, certainly in government policies, and there was all sorts of reasons where that practice was possibly losing ground in all sorts of ways, in sort of all sorts of places. Not many MA courses now talk about this, surprisingly. There's only a few places that sort of have conversations around this sort of thing. So it was helpful, I think, for people that were out of the academic system in terms of universities, who were in schools, to think about how that relates to what they were doing, how it would be relevant to what they were doing. And when we sort of started, we talked about, well, just very simply, well, why would we want to do this? Well, you know, what are the key factors that we would want to identify? And we kept coming back to a report that was written in about 2006 about the Artisteacher scheme. Some of you may remember it in its sort of early stages. And there was a report that kind of identified three very simple aspects that kind of resonate with why we'd want to do this. So, one, it talked about the fact that teachers' personal development as artists can have a direct beneficial impact on their effectiveness as teachers, and as a result, on their students' learning and creativity. Two, that richness and complexity of contemporary art practice and the diversity of thinking and influences which inform it can enhance teachers' subject knowledge, and many of them identified, certainly in the early stages, this as being really important for them, and can enable them to make positive contributions to the delivery of their curriculum. And curriculum, something that certainly is, we've already sort of heard several times today, is quite contentious and all sorts of issues because of the present orthodoxy. And three, the partnership between major galleries and museums of contemporary art and prestigious institutions of higher education. This is not me sort of saying this about my institution, I'm not too sure about some of these statements, but anyway, can provide the most stimulating locations and contexts in which to achieve those ends, and foster the raising of teaching standards and pupils' attainment, and can assist cultural entitlement by creating greater access to the visual arts and culture. Now that's kind of where we sort of started in trying to sort of think about how one might justify why we're doing this, how one might want to sort of listen to the sort of participants in terms of their needs, and one of the most, I haven't talked about this, but one of the nice exercises I remember doing right at the beginning was just quite simple, and just sort of asking people, what do you hope for? Because I thought the sort of word hope seemed to sort of, at that moment in time, where so many of us felt that you know, because of the present crisis, that hope wasn't something we'd really banded around that often, or really sort of felt comfortable about sort of talking about. So it's sort of just asking very simple questions. Well, why? What are you hoping for? And in terms of the Freelands, I think it kind of resonated for them because it shared some of their aims. They value the sort of importance of developing artistic practice. They aim to work definitely with underrepresented groups. And I think for them, this was a very key part in starting a relationship that's flourished and developed in all sorts of different ways, because it was quite a small organisation in those days. It's kind of grown really quite quickly. But this is kind of an ongoing dialogue, and there's, you know, there's a number of previous kind of relationships, projects, engagements that have gone on, and I'm not going to talk about those. I'm just going to talk about this one theme, one aspect within the early stages, because I think it kind of helps sort of start to think about the sorts of things that we're trying to unpack, the sort of places that we're starting to sort of maybe move towards or start to sort of think about. Okay. When I was thinking about this, you know, I think ultimately one of the key words that in this collaboration is that sort of sense, Wenger's sense of the community of practice. The community of artists and their diverse practice was always really important. The group is predominantly, I would say, about 60-something% of them are secondary art teachers. There's about 10% of them that are kind of primary sort of, they would describe themselves as primarily specialists. And then there's a kind of another sort of bit of a third that are kind of more self-employed, independent, some work in galleries, some sessional, some working sorts of workshop studios situations, and then there's a few of us from, not many of us from HE and from FE. But it was kind of important that that was kind of key, that there was this kind of range, there was this diversity, there was these different perspectives that were that constantly feed into what drives what we do and how we do it. A lot of them at the beginning talked about the feeling that they'd gone into education and they'd missed opportunities for their own learning. Missed opportunities for their own learning about practice and about thinking about art. And importantly, they, you know, one of the things that we started to sort of unpack a little bit as Terry was alluding to, those tensions between your own making and your learners and your own and education. And I think that kind of helped, and still keeps coming up and still kind of continues. It helps kind of think about those sort of tensions, those relationships, you know, or constantly sort of as people develop and change and move throughout this sort of thing. There was lots of kind of issues around people feeling slightly uncomfortable at the early part with the idea of the identity and talking about identity. Similar to sort of, you know, thinking about how they're cast, how they have been cast, how they are viewed by others in terms of their image, their self-image as artists and as artist teachers. And I think that's kind of inspired many to sort of go away and sort of almost like re-evaluate some of their kinds of ways of operating and thinking, and how that has inspired them to give them confidence in some ways to express some of those concerns in a group and express and develop some thinking around these kinds of aspects within the group. But we've dedicated a lot of time to sort of the intellectual and the critical kind of pursuit and engagement, as well as the practical kind of engagement. And some of them just talk about the fact that it's been really helpful just to get back their mojo, just to sort of feel good about themselves and feel good about being able to sort of, in a group, share some of these things. And I think this is really quite interesting at this moment in time when, you know, sort of a lot of things are quite difficult in educational contexts and some of these sort of areas. And we've worked hard to make this be about, you know, co-designing and co-creating at different stages where we are exploring and what we're exploring. It's quite difficult during the pandemic, but in some ways going online in the pandemic was kind of interesting. We certainly picked up different people during the pandemic, because initially, I think we started in about 2019, there was about, maybe no more than about 30, 40 of us that would meet face-to-face in the gallery. And we had about a year of that, where we would be sort of doing quite practical, orientated things, group exhibitions, and sharing, and then it went just a bit crazy during the pandemic, and we went online, and we've got like a network of over 500 people that want to contribute, and so we're having to now think about, well, how do we maintain the interest in this sort of blended face-to-face and online, and now that the things have gone really kind of more region, even globally. I've got people in Moscow and California that want to join, which is kind of a little bit staggering in some respects. But I mean, how do we maintain those regional interests? And this is kind of the next phase. I'm not going to talk about that, but this is the next sort of way that we're sort of pondering of how we can sort of continue to work in this way and develop programs that are responding to particular needs and ways of working. How we can continue to co-create, co-design when people are, you know, sort of in Glasgow. So we use a number of methods and a number of sort of ways, and you know, there's some of it, as I said, some of them are more like events, some of them are more like exhibitions, some of them are a little bit like crits. Some of them are discussions and presentations. Some people are invited. So the one you can see on the top here is Harold Duffy, who we were given the opportunity to submit some work, and he selected 5 people from the cohort who wanted to sort of have a crit with Harold. And so what was quite interesting is, you know, he got to choose who we would like to talk about and who we would like to talk to. And it was quite an interesting sort of opportunity for people to sort of have a crit. And, you know, that's quite, you know, if you've been working for sort of 20 years in a school and you want somebody to sort of, there's not many opportunities for somebody to talk to you about your work. There's not many spaces where you can go where somebody can kind of, you know, in a trusted and supportive environment, sort of help you think through what you were doing. So some of these kind of things are really kind of seminal, as well as workshops, but less. In fact, the next one is on Monday, if anybody's interested. I think it's sold out, but there's a kind of an opportunity to look at, in more of a workshop way, the notion of performing. So performing and performance in teaching and certainly as an artist. So how did I start the Where We Work theme? Kind of came from an interest in thinking about, I know it came out of a talk, you know, conversations around initially people's problems with the idea of a studio and an artist in a studio, and the sort of stereotypical ideas of what that looks like and what does that mean, or that doesn't really work with me, or doesn't really relate to sort of, you know, what I do or how I. So I kind of very quickly sort of put some of these kind of problematic aspects, as well as some of those kind of interesting aspects of it's a bit of a slightly meandering side street, but it did kind of help us sort of test out some of the sort of context, which are the stories that I'll share a bit later. So I've got a random selection of artists and their studios, which caught the attention and caught the imagination of how we understand these spaces or places for making. And these are kind of historical, modern and contemporary sort of spaces to think about how these have perhaps... And you'll notice that, as you can imagine, many of the traditional images of studios are wholly, you know, dead white European males, i.e. the canon, and it's only until we get sort of more inclusive examples and samples as we move more to the contemporary and the modern that we see these kinds of greater representations. And so that kind of historical into the contemporary, this is not definitive, it was just a kind of a stimulus, but I think, as you can see here, you know, the sort of idea of how perhaps artists have depicted themselves in studios, and Hogarth here sort of satirising himself was kind of an interesting start. But then we've got how other artists have seen other artists' studio, and I think this is kind of an interesting example here because it's kind of a more recent version of Rembrandt's, kind of an interpretation of Rembrandt's studio. The translation there, I think, from Kunstkammer is a room full of art. But it's interesting to see through the eyes of the artist how others are viewing and imagining and sort of thinking about artists. And this clip, this is a still from a film, a recent film by Mike Lee about Turner, that was actually filmed in Turner's studio in Pepworth House. I don't know if anybody knows Pepworth House. It's a stately home owned by the National Trust in Sussex, where he actually did work, and he did sort of live from work for a period of time. But I think it's quite interesting how even the media has kind of hooked into this. And you know, I know that we mentioned Grace and Perry earlier as somebody that during COVID came to the fore in terms of opening his sort of, not just his thoughts, but also certainly his studio for people to sort of look in and think about, well, you know, what are we doing in these places? What's going on? You know, and it's not until we sort of get to sort of around the sort of modernist, and this is sort of Bloomsbury group, where a whole community turned a rural, remote farmhouse in the early sort of 1900s, sort of between the wars and the First World War into the Second World War, where they made their whole farmhouse a making space, you know, kind of a little community of Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant, where you can still see the preserved studios. The attic studio at the top there of Vanessa Bell's studio is presently being used by Langan and Bell as a kind of an installation, thinking about absence of artists and artist studios and absence, which I think is really quite interesting. And the bottom large photograph is the Duncan Grant studio. It looks like that. It's perfectly hermetically sealed as he left it. You know, I think he died in the 70s. I can't remember. But and even every part of the house is painted and decorated. The wall, the fireplace, the furniture, the curtains, everything is sort of has the hand of Vanessa Bell. So it's quite interesting when we think about that blurring of the boundaries and the relationship between the domestic, the home, the community, the space. And then there's these kind of, you know, intriguing sort of more homely or domestic looks, where a man's painting in a suit and a tie, which, you know, there's many pictures, as you can imagine, of Picasso's studio, usually standing with his shirt off, showing his round posture. But then there's also paintings of interiors of studios, which I thought was quite interesting. It's been a source for stimulating and making, you know, from the sort of neo-impressionist here to sort of a more recent watercolour by Sargent, which I think is quite sort of interesting, and that's space. And it's not just the painters, I hasten to add, most of them are dead white European male painters. The sculptors getting on the act too. You know, Barbara Hepworth's studio, perfectly preserved. There's almost as if she just walked out to get a bottle of whiskey and a packet of fags in her village in St. Ives. It's almost literally, you can feel the dust, you can feel the skin of Barbara Hepworth still evident in the space in the studio on the right. And Brancusi's studio, lock, stock and barrel, has been sort of, I think he was the one he was in Paris. May have been his studio in Paris, it may have been I can't remember, but it's been rebuilt, transported to the centre of Pompidou, and everything's rebuilt in the square of his studio, as he died, which I think is really kind of just odd. But then we've got more contemporary sort of spaces where artists, they look more industrial spaces. That's interesting when we think about the equipment, the specialism, maybe the materials and the processes and the production, and how these things have changed, and therefore how these spaces have changed and moved. There's obviously things that, you know, that aren't inside, things that take place, you know, in situ in different places and different wilderness, you know, different types of wildernesses. Kind of David Nash there, and even Peckham shopping precinct just down the road for sort of is an interesting sort of place to think about where making takes place for somebody like Gillian Waring, and yeah, and even her partner, you know, abandoned spaces. I don't know if everybody remembers this, but you know, the C&A on Oxford Street in about 2000, I think it was, maybe 99, 2000, I can't remember, was abandoned, and Art Angel took it over with Michael Landy to complete a commission called Breaking Down, where he sort of publicly and very openly, in a kind of a real spectacle, collaborated with a number of other artists to destroy every piece of his life. He just unpacked, unpicked and broke down everything from his dad's precious sheep coat to his passport and his lovely Volvo car. I think it was a Volvo. No, I think it may have been a Saab, I can't remember, car. And then sort of post-studio sort of making, we've got people that sort of talk about, you know, sort of more flexible notions. And again, that was raised earlier about the idea that the studio might still bind us for some processes and some things, but actually, you know, anybody went to see Thesta Gates at the Whitechapel recently would have seen how his ceramic studio is very key, but actually a lot of his social practice, a lot of his kind of installation work involved people and communities and building these sorts of houses, building these spaces. You know, they're very much a part of his kind of way of work. These are the things that influence his activism. These are the things that influence urban planning, for instance, is a part of this. And the last one I think I wanted to show was kind of artists that were interested. I had a really interesting conversation with Faisal a few years ago when I lived in Hackney and he lived, I think it was Hackney and Wick, his studio. He had a studio above a barber's, and the barbers were a kind of a place where a lot of clearly men came to not just get their haircut, but to have conversations, to just sort of talk about the everyday realities. And he would be upstairs listening while he was making, and if anything kind of struck his interest, he'd sort of nip down and sort of join in and maybe cut hair at the same time, because on the side he would do a little bit of haircut. So anything that grabbed his attention, you know, he'd want to join in. So anything that was to do about, you know, sort of masculinity aspects, or talking about myth or history and representation, etc., you know, all became part of his sort of part of his work. His sort of barber shop was the stimulus, the source, the way of being able to engage, and I think that's kind of interesting. I think he invited. There was also I think about 2018 there was a kind of an invite where you could come and get your hair cut by Faisal, and he would talk to you about absolutely anything. It's a little bit like sort of a Marina Abramovich moment where you could sit across the table and sort of look at him and sort of have a little think about things. I've got too many sort of classrooms to contrast this with, because I think the stories tell us a little bit about that. But what I've got, which I thought was really interesting, is I found this online from an American art teacher who describes himself as an art education guru. Instantly got my attention. I just thought, oh my goodness, if Boris knew that there was an art education guru out there, then clearly that would be the way forward. But this person just shared the perfect art room. Well, that in itself is an interesting kind of anomaly. And he lists for us all the important must-haves, needs, wants, and helpful items, which sounds very sort of neoliberal and sort of problematic. But I did sort of think that as I've gone increasingly around many schools, they're all starting to look the same. They're all starting to become the same. There's more problems with the orthodoxy than I've ever seen, and I think academisation has made them more the same. So I think there's something there that we also wanted to sort of unpack. I'll leave that one. Okay. So that was the stimulus in terms of how do I start conversation in a way that's not too intimidating, in a way that's going to be supportive, where we get people to, in the early stages, open up about spaces, about their art, about their practice, about their processes, about their production, their making, their teaching. So, because we wanted to do it in a way that didn't become too disempowering. So we just very simply asked people in the network to take one image, to select one photograph, to take or make one image, one photograph of where we work, where they work. Write a short statement to accompany the image, and then we would exhibit it. We would simply mount it and display it in the gallery, and over a glass of wine we invited people just to respond, to share, to discuss, and in the end there was about 19 pieces that came together. And I think it was a really interesting sort of way to get confidence in our sort of getting going with these kinds of conversations. There was lots of things that concentrated around personal systems, how we sort of got them to sort of think about, you know, working. Yeah, I mean, many people wanted to talk about how they were living in limbo or in sort of how they struggled to carve out space, time, metaphorical, literal. So there was lots of unexpected things and responses, you know, lots of questions, but I think it was a really nice start point. And I've recorded, as I said, I've got 8 just to share with you now. I'm just going to show you the image, just show you the text so that we can sort of just get a sense of some of these early start points. So Kate is a head department in a secondary art school in West London, and her engagement, recent practice and engagement, has led her to sort of, after a year or so of working in the network, to want to go on to sort of think about doing an MA, and is presently developing her practice and presently developing an MA, and has also started to think about, well, you know, I've desired a studio, but do I really want one, and what does it look like, and how does this relate to my present context? So as you can see here, she says, I was taking photographs of my desk at home, where I read and think, and why I try to, and you know, how I try to make. And she was also thinking a lot about, you know, how would I make my studio? What would my studio be, you know, if I had one to work in, because I presently don't. But documenting these spaces felt like exhibiting in a rather superficial way, and for the sake of it. Then that evening, one evening, during a live drawing session with a small group of sixth formers, all of us working together to a very loud Brian Eno track, I photographed an experiential space. This is where art is happening, somewhere between the teaching and making, not for the purpose of exhibiting, but as a process and an experience. And I think that's kind of quite an interesting sort of reflections on you know, where she's perhaps at in her sort of thinking and her work. Now, Emily is a technician and works in a North London school, and she's kind of new to teaching. I think she'd only been in a school about a year by the time she did this. So my studio is the space that I habitually return to explore ideas and to give time to remembering what my motivations are. It is where I go to shake things up in order to make connections and follow a thread. Running does that. Oh, I've mixed this up, haven't I? Apologies. That should be Andy. Yes, I've mixed it up. Sorry, I'll go back. Yeah, okay, I've copied into my notes the wrong one. So Emily talks about this as my studio is in my home. I share the space with my boyfriend Lawrence, really nice chap, a musician. But I can imagine if he was making music while I was trying to work, it'd be very annoying because his music's not, it's not sort of calming music. I have a difficult relationship with this space, so it's frequently becomes a bit of a mess, a physical mess, as well as a space where I get my head in a pickle. Saying that it would ultimately allow me to make and to think with my lovely plans for emotional support. So you see how she's trying to create in her mind a sort of a picture of what she wants. It's easy to get distracted with all the modern stuff we have access these days, and really getting absorbed in making is hypnotic, it's addictive, it's a wonderful, fulfilling way. It's like being in a trance. I think his music was a bit trance-like, isn't it? Having a space, even a small one, allows me to lose myself from time to time. And in terms of what I'm making, I'll make everything and anything. I'm usually making stuff for someone else. That's interesting. Making stuff for myself is the hardest of all. And there's several of them sort of talk about that relationship and how that difficulty. I started reading Andy's, I apologise. So Andy is the head of faculty in a very large secondary school on the edge of London. And he was somebody we followed up in the COVID phase, and we had a kind of another talk, just about 2 or 3 of them, about how their work has developed during sort of COVID. And he talked a lot about his art in the classroom being about activism with his pupils, about sort of exploring issues and the political environment and sort of contemporary issues that were perhaps that drove his practice. So my studio is the place that I habitually return to explore ideas and give time to remembering what my motivations are. It's where I go to shake things up. Where I go to shake things up. Yeah, in order to make connections and follow a thread. So this is a picture of him on a run. He's out sort of on his nightly sort of run, and this is him starting to find that space to sort of ponder on these things. However, it's not quite enough. Running is like shaking a snow globe. Beautiful ideas float around and connect to one another, but unless they are fixed, though these words, the connection get lost and the snow falls and it's shaken up again. I run and I fix my ideas by recording them as I warm down in the park and take photographs. And he sort of talks about going on home and drawing and recording. He also talks about the fact that the Freelands Foundation offer another potential space to extend motivation and strengthen connections. So my studio is a physical and a social. It's when I run and when we meet. The work starts with the run and develops later when we plan for the work with his pupils, with his students. Rebecca started in schools but very quickly left and now kind of works, I suppose, as a freelancer. That's the best way to describe it. Freelance, full-time freelance, where she works sometimes in museums and galleries, sometimes in her studio delivering workshop spaces for young people. And she talks about this slightly differently. My studio space is, and you can see it quite clearly, quite sort of almost like small industrial sort of batch kind of production. My studio space is a community ceramic studio in Peckham. The sharing ethos of the studio is something that I hugely value and allows for conversations to flow easily about materials, about making and ideas. I find the dynamic of a shared studio keeps me engaged and keeps me making. Running group crypts in the space, attending classes and talks continually feeds into my practice and gives me space to learn and to develop. Kiva is an interesting character, slightly comes at this from another kind of perspective. She works mainly in community-based groups, usually works with issue-based types of projects, but she also teaches on a few sessions in FE and also works, as she describes here, in galleries. So I work in a variety of places, predominantly work at the Tate across both sites in London, which sees me in the office and in the learning environments. These spaces where the exhibitions, I work with a large group of people, freelancers, developing new workshops, resources, programs to suit all ages. So it's a different one day to the next. The conversations I have with my co-workers and artists and visitors and artists inspire me and give me ideas, and does the view from the office on my trips into work, so does the work, in the trips and work in between the sites. The changing landscape around me and the differing points of view bring as many challenges as ideas. So I spend a lot of time thinking, making lists, sorting out the noise, blowing away the cobwebs. And it's interesting, she doesn't want the noise. She's not interested in the noise, but wondering about how to make her own private practice actually happen. And she goes on and talks a little bit about sort of her home situation. And that's for her. This is a picture of being on the bus. This is where she finds it's her own space time to be able to sort of create. I'm going to skip this one because it's quite long. Clara is a head of department again in a sort of North London, but new head of department, and she talks about the dark room as being her space in the school. The photography dark room, my ideal workplace, is where I wish I could be the majority of the time. This photograph is an abstract which reflects my fascination in elevating the mundane. It was taken a part of an art pedagogy challenge to photograph something red, a very daily challenge. I enjoyed the project as the impetus to my work every day. I took this photograph using my mobile phone and is the medium I use the majority of the time. In retrospect, I should have photographed the streets or my home with my mobile phone, as recently this has been the space I would work in on a regular basis. Okay. Yeah, okay, John, I'll perhaps skip John because I'm running short of time, but John talks about his sort of relationship to the domestic, the home, and his painting. And interestingly, John, when I met him 3 years, well, maybe 4 or 5 years ago I met him, but we had a conversation. I was out on practice, he's one of our mentors. I was out in practice and visiting, and he was quite sort of timid about wanting to talk about his own work. And now it's kind of gone full cycle, and I noticed that only 2 weeks ago he was exhibiting in an exhibition of his work in Walthamstow. So it's kind of interesting how some people have been empowered and being able to find some of these moments, these gaps, and some of these kinds of relationships, synergies to sort of do this. So it's difficult to make too many conclusions or make transferable points, as the range, as you've seen in these drawings, is so wide and quite rich on a kind of an individual basis. However, I can make a few observations, and I've tried to sort of put a few sort of, I think, tempted a few sort of references, not too many for you, that might kind of get the sort of thinking. I think the range is important. And these different sort of systems, these different places that suit different artist-teachers' practice, I think has been sort of really important too, and there's tensions in that to engage with. I use kind of some of Pringle's theory in Emily Pringle's theory in asking how can we develop the tools to talk on behalf of what we do. And I think some of those steps about thinking about how we've been constructing as a group some of the knowledge has been sort of interesting. And I also just started to think a little bit about the sort of the word care, and also just referencing what you were saying earlier about the etymology of the word. I think I was looking at the word curation, because I started thinking about how we're kind of curating what we've been doing, and curating the sort of learning, curating the space, creating the sort of, and I was intrigued to see that the Latin of that means of curation means care, to take care of. It comes from curing, so to cure somebody, not like smoke them, but to cure them from their illnesses, to sort of cure them from their sort of disease, to help them. I think that's quite interesting that sort of has that sort of root, that history. And so we've spoken a lot in the group about how we are taking care of each other as a community, and thinking about that sort of importance of how we structure and support that culture of care. And that's been very intentional to think about how then we grow and then how we maintain. And in that sense, I clearly acknowledge that we're not that good at doing everything, but I think that's been one of those aspects that I think the network that the participants would say has been important, and the way that we've developed the trust to be able to get to that sort of point with those different lived kinds of experiences, I think has been sort of helpful. There's been conversations around identity, or the shifting and changing of identity. There's lots of conversations about how we've been empowering and sort of thinking about how we can deal with some of the tensions that exist within sort of divergence and within change and within the challenge. But it's very much about collaboration, about the community, about how you can facilitate some that want more slow, silent space, and others that want more engaging, and others that want something that's perhaps more relatable as opposed to theoretical. Ultimately I think it comes down to this constant dialogue, this constant sharing, this constant testing out and developing and discovering together, that's probably helped us reflect on our processes and helped us think about how we sort of move. Oddly, one of the, and it didn't set out to do this, but one of the teachers, Clara, for instance, at the end of the session recently said, "Oh, this is the best CPD ever." And I kind of thought about it. I thought, well,